The sight of Julio's gun out of the holster, beginning to point at them, sent everyone into a panic. Many voices shouted, accusing. Others screamed in terror, and still others in despair. Julio brandished his weapon at the group, trying to make himself be heard, but he was drowned out by the sheer panic swarming through the group. Finally, he pointed his gun straight up and pulled the trigger. The exclamation of the bullet bursting into the air was like thunder. It made the group wince and go silent all at once. He marveled. It worked just like in the movies. Then he began to speak, his voice already hoarse from so much shouting. "You all heard the man in the vision," he said, eyeing each one of the people in front of him. He thought about how each one had a child trapped in a nightmare world, and yet one of them had caused this all to happen. Their frightened, angry, and confused faces gave away nothing but sincere, supercharged emotion. Which one was the traitor? These thoughts passed through his mind quickly before he spoke again. "One of us is the person who invited the moving house. Someone here opened the door," he said. They all looked around, looking less afraid and more accusatory. "So who wants to confess?" No one spoke or moved for a long time. In fact, it seemed that everyone barely dared to breathe, as if the slightest sound might set off another bout of chaos. Julio lowered the gun to his side, but kept a firm grip on it. "Now, we are going to go through each one of your stories and find out who is behind this," he said. "But how do we know it isn't you?" Stacy said. Some of the others nodded. "We all have an interest in keeping our children out of danger, but you have no one," Alicia said. As soon as the words were out of her mouth, she gasped and raised her hands to her lips, her eyes going wide. She regretted saying something so harsh, even under these circumstances. Julio's face fell. "You're right," he said through clenched teeth. "I don't have anyone, not in the moving house or otherwise. Yet if I was the one who orchestrated this, then why would I bother interrogating you? I would have shot you all already." That caused another ponderous silence. Heather raised a hand. It was an odd thing for a grown-up to do. All of a sudden, she looked to everyone who grew up with her that she was in high school again. Her words swept away such fanciful notions from their minds. "I know how we can figure out who summoned the moving house," she said. Stacy gawked. "What?" she said. "How can you possibly know something like that?" Heather pointed to the book that was still in Julio's hand, the one that wasn't holding the gun. "The answer has to be in there," she said. The others looked troubled at her words. "I'm not going back in there," a man said. A woman agreed. Alicia also looked mortified. "What if it transports us like before?" she said. Heather shook her head. "I think the book showed us everything it was going to show," she said. "Besides, it sent us back with all the information we needed, right?" Stacy nodded. "I think I understand. We need to keep reading," she said. "It might give us another clue to find out whoever did this, because whoever it is, they are not confessing." That brought a dark shadow of grim fear over the group. One of them was not telling the truth. Even one of their own children was caught by the moving house. There was no telling what a monster like that is capable of. "So you want me to keep reading?" Julio said, looking unsure. He found that he didn't want to keep holding on to the book, yet he did not set it down. Alicia held up her hands and stepped forward. It took all of Julio's self-control not to point the gun at her. "Who can we trust to read the book, though?" she said. "If there is someone here that is a traitor, they might misread the book on purpose. Then we must eliminate at least one person from suspicion, beyond any doubt," Heather said. "Sure," Julio said, "but how do you propose we do that?" "I've been thinking," Stacy said. "Maybe the person isn't even in the room with us. It could be anyone in town, maybe even Tolman. Or his driver, Alicia said. He is the one that actually locked us in here. But he did that on Tolman's orders, Stacy said. Did he? Julio said. Also, how did Tolman even know to be there when the fire happened? His home is so far away that he wouldn't have noticed until the smoke was higher in the sky. Unless he knew it would be coming, Heather said. Or the person who was with him knew, Stacy said. Just as she finished speaking, there was a scratching sound on the other side of the locked door. As one, they all turned to see the handle turning as someone from the other side began to open the door. The door swung open. In the doorway, the darkened silhouette of the driver stood. He held something in his hand. It dangled, and looking at it gave Stacy a sick feeling she could not explain. Very good, the driver said, though it is too late. He thrust his hand into the light. The object clutched in his grasp was Tolman's severed head. The eyes were wide with terror, and a permanent, silent scream was frozen on his face. An already discolored tongue lolled from between his teeth. Dark blood dripped onto the floor in a maddening pat onto the hardwood floor. They all screamed and recoiled in horror and disgust. Some closed their eyes, and others began to weep. Julio recovered quicker than the rest, dropping the book and raising his gun, holding it with both hands now. "Drop the head and put your hands up," he said, having to shout at the top of his voice to be heard over the frightened din. The man did not drop the head. Instead, he threw it right at them. They screamed and scattered like birds to the wind. The head landed with a sickening, wet thud in the middle of the room. What happened next was worse. It rolled forward, not in a straight line. It bounced on its uneven surface at odd angles, which caused it to change course several times until it finally came towards Stacy. She screamed and tried to back away, but she hit the wall, and in her blind panic, she didn't think to turn to the side. Just as the head was about to reach her, it came to a stop. The face of Mr. Tolman stared out at her. Frank horror still painted there. A few people threw up. Stacy trembled, not only because of how close she had come to being touched by the macabre body part, but because she had the insane notion that the head was going to start talking. What is worse, because of the way it was facing, it would be talking straight to her. "Hey, he's gone," someone said. Everyone looked up, and sure enough, the doorway now stood open and empty. The driver was nowhere to be seen. Stacy looked down, half expecting the head to have also disappeared, and for all of it to have been an elaborate magic trick. One that she never wanted to ever see performed again. Yet to her dismay, the head was still there. She stepped around it and then ran to the other side of the room, feeling as if insects were crawling all over her skin. She danced them away and was immediately embraced by Heather, who sobbed on her shoulder. "Oh God, Amber is out there," she said, tears flowing. "I just want her back." Stacy also began to cry, but it didn't last long because it suddenly hit her. The door was open. "Heather, everyone, come on," she said, as everyone recovered from the shock. She started towards the door, then turned back when she didn't sense too many people coming behind her. She saw only Heather, Alicia, and Julio had joined her. Everyone else remained against the wall, trembling. "What's the matter with you all?" Heather said. "Don't you want to save your children?" One woman pointed a shaking finger towards the empty hallway. "But that madman is still out there," she said. "He might kill us too." Heather opened her mouth but stopped when Stacy laid a hand on her shoulder. She shook her head at her friend. "It's no use," Stacy said. "They are too afraid. We can't wait for them to gather their courage." "But it's their children, for God's sake," Heather said. "How can they do this?" Alicia hugged Heather. "Don't," she said. "They are making their choice. They have to live with it. Julio stepped up to the doorway and looked around, though there really weren't many places the driver could have been hiding. He waved to the others. "Coast is clear," he said. "It's now or never. We need to move before that psycho decides to lock us in here again." Stacy, Alicia, and Heather followed him into the hallway. They only got a few steps when the door began to close on its own. They turned back when they heard the alarmed cries. "Wait," the woman who had opted to stay moments ago said, her eyes wild and pleading. "No!" Julio said. He rushed back, but just before he could reach the door, it slammed closed. Inside, they could hear the people continuing to scream for them to be let out and pounding the door with their fists. Julio yanked on the door handle with all his strength, but it would not budge. "Hold on," he said, and raised his gun. "Back away from the door." He didn't think anyone heard him on the other side. He didn't want to accidentally shoot someone while trying to rescue them. He wasn't proud of this thought, but it was a lot of paperwork and headaches if that happened. He kept shouting for everyone to back away when the voices on the other side all of a sudden grew immediately quiet. In the hallway, they all looked at each other. "Hello?" Stacy said. No answer. Julio tried to get a response as well. Still nothing. The air was dead silent. Until it wasn't. Out of nowhere, there was the sound of rusty hinges screaming in the air. Then, they heard different screams. Screams of terror. Something monstrous roared, and the terrified screams became ones of agony. There were fleshy, ripping and tearing sounds. Heather screamed when she felt something wet touch her shoe. She jumped back. Everyone looked down at her shoe to see what the matter was. A dark red stain covered the toe. They all turned slowly towards the door, their gazes following along the floor. There, outside the door, was a growing crimson pool. It was blood. On the other side of the door, the sound of hinges screeching rose again. Then it faded, and everything was silent again. Stacy, Alicia, Heather, and Julio stared, their feet rooted. It seemed forever before one of them finally moved. It was Julio, and he reached out as far as he could for the door handle without stepping into the pool of blood. "Don't," Stacy said, hissing the word. Julio didn't listen, and this time, when he tried to turn the door handle, it came easy, and he swung the door open. He raised the gun, his whole body shaking, ready to fire at the first thing that moved. Yet nothing stirred inside the room. The space was now trashed. Furniture smashed and the walls slashed by what could only have been giant claws. Yet the worst thing about the whole scene wasn't the mess that was left behind. It was what was missing, namely the bodies of all those who had been trapped inside. They were all gone.